Should we get started? It's 9 p.m. Yeah, okay. Okay, so welcome. Good evening, everyone, and good morning to Neil and Anne. So today I'm very happy to be hosting this special seminar by my favorite couple in academia so far. It's Dr. Neil and Anne Koblitzs. And I should introduce myself. I'm Christine Luk. I'm Associate Professor at the Department of the History of Science at Tsinghua University in Beijing. I included a link to the announcement of the seminar in the chat, so people can click on the link and see a brief description of the speakers and what the talk is about. The title of the talk is the Koblitzs Forays into the History of Science, Humanities, and Global Affairs. So I will just give some brief highlights of what I included in that announcement. Dr. Neil Koblitzs received his PhD in mathematics from Princeton University in 1974. He spent 1.5 years in Moscow and then 3.5 years at Harvard. And he ended up at the University of Washington in Seattle. And he is still there teaching at the Department of Mathematics. He works in number theory and cryptography. I think he recently also won a prize, shared a prize called the Leption Prize in 2021. So Neil will begin by talking about the importance of the humanities for careers in science and technology, giving examples of the value of being broadly educated and some of the tragic mistakes that scientists can make when they are ignorant of the humanistic implications of what they do. And Dr. Anne Koblitzs got her PhD from Boston University in 1983. Her thesis is about the life and work of the pioneering mathematician Sofia Kovalevskaya. She ended up at Arizona State University. She was there between 1998 and 2017 at Women and Gender Studies, and also chair and member of my dissertation committee. So she will talk about the interactions of gender and science in places outside of Europe and North America. And so they have been very active in global philanthropy. That's the third part of the talk, global affairs. I know they are very active in Vietnam, and they both received the President's Friendship Medal of the government of Vietnam. So without further ado, I'll just give the floor to you, and you can take as long as you want, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. Yeah, so please.
Thank you very much, Professor Luke, for the invitation and for the introduction. I will share the screen now. Is that clear to everyone? Is that all right?
Yes, it works perfectly.
Okay, so we're really grateful for the invitation to speak with you this evening on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the School of Humanities of Tsinghua University. I want to share with you my perspective on why people who intend to work in science and technology really need a strong humanistic education. I'll start by making a few comments about MIT, since MIT can be considered the Tsinghua University of America. Sometimes people talk about Tsinghua as the MIT of China, since they are two of the very top technical universities in the world. MIT has had leading scholars in the humanities, for example, in the history of science. Dirk Stroik, the Dutch-American historian of mathematics, was at MIT. He wrote a very popular history of mathematics called A Concise History of Mathematics that was recently translated into Chinese. Also, Kenneth Manning, author of a wonderful book called Black Apollo of Science, which is the biography of an African-American biologist, E.E. Just, who made basic discoveries in cell biology. And Lauren Graham, who's the top US expert on the history of Soviet and Russian science, is also at MIT. There are famous intellectuals at MIT in other areas of the humanities. Perhaps the best known is Noam Chomsky, who is a famous linguist and also known as a philosopher and a prolific political writer. At MIT, students are required to take at least 8 courses in the humanities, arts, and social sciences. The MIT website explains this as follows. The requirement enables students to deepen their knowledge in a variety of cultural and disciplinary areas and encourages the development of sensibilities and skills vital to an effective and satisfying life as an individual, a professional, and a member of society. So I want to explain the professional part of this, why studying the humanities, by which I mean, for example, reading great literature, studying history, studying foreign languages, literatures, and cultures, is important for science and technology professionals. Here, first are a couple of photos. Here's a picture of Dirk Stroik's book. This is the English version, but there is a Chinese version, and the famous intellectual Noam Chomsky. So why does a scientist need a broad education? Well, any scientist who wants to present work at a major conference or publish it in a leading journal should really know how to write well. The most important parts of our articles are the abstract and introduction. In fact, that's all that most people read. They don't usually want to read the details of the technical part. And it's what they judge us by. That is, they judge the value of an article by reading the introduction and abstract. A good introduction should be informative for non-specialists. It tells a story that starts with the statement of the problem, explanation of why it's important, and a summary of earlier work, and then gives an overview of the paper's contributions and ends with the challenges for future research and development. Similarly, the success of a grant application or an executive summary of a project report depends on the facility one has at conveying one's technical accomplishments in a language that includes the context, the history, and the direction of the work. In all of this, the common element is the ability to tell a story. A fundamental part of human culture is storytelling. There's a popular misconception that a good piece of technical work is just a sequence of formulas and calculations, and maybe some technical information. This is not correct. That, in fact, a good piece of technical work is part of a story that has a long plot line and a large cast of characters. Most scientific and mathematical research in our time is by multiple authors. It's not that common to see important papers written that are singly authored. Usually they're written by a team. And when the research relates to practical problems rather than only to theory, it's essential to have a multidisciplinary team because practical problems generally involve more than one specialty. And often that should include non-scientists because they're better than we are at understanding the human side of the problem. If scientists are broadly educated, they can communicate better to non-scientists and work better with non-scientists. On the other hand, if they take a narrow approach without a multidisciplinary team, they can make tragic mistakes that cause a lot of harm. I'll later describe such a tragic mistake at my own university, the University of Washington, that resulted from a narrow approach to the COVID-19 pandemic. So how can a student learn to tell a story well? That is, how can a student of science and technology learn to communicate well with non-scientists? Well, as I said, reading great literature, studying history, studying foreign languages, foreign cultures, and literature. They all broaden one's outlook and make it much easier to interact with non-scientists. In my own career, studies of the humanities have been essential. Now, my secondary school did not actually have a very good math program, and so I studied mathematics almost entirely on my own outside of school. Nevertheless, I'm extremely grateful to that school for two things, and neither of them is directly connected with mathematics. First of all, the school had a program in the Russian language. I studied Russian for 3 years in secondary school and then took courses in Russian literature at the university level. After my PhD then, since I knew Russian and I was quite familiar with literature and culture, so I could participate effectively in the exchange programs that existed then between universities and between academies of sciences between the United States and the USSR. And I did for a year. I was over there in Moscow for a year, 1974 to 75, and a half year in 1978 and in 1985. At that time, this was still during the Soviet period, when Russia was a socialist country. At that time, Moscow had more top mathematicians than any other city in the world, even compared to Paris or compared to London or any city in the United States. So it was a wonderful time to be able to study and do research in mathematics in Moscow. Also, I loved Russian literature, especially the novels of Dostoevsky, where I got insight into Russian culture and also into the complexities of human psychology, which was something that was a big part of the novels of Dostoevsky. Now, the second reason why I'm grateful to my secondary school is that they had excellent teachers of English who had very high standards, and over a period of 4 years taught me how to write well, how to use language well. As a result, I've been able to write many non-technical articles for the public. Now, this coming year and a year ago, I teach a seminar on public writing at the University of Washington, which has the title, Math That Lies, Communicating Why Some Quantitative Arguments Are Misleading or Bogus, that is, fallacious. Let me now give one example of math that lies. That is one example of bad use of mathematics that had harmful consequences during the early weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States. My university has an institute called the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, IHME, and it consists mainly of applied mathematicians. Early in the COVID-19 pandemic, they produced a mathematical model that predicted that the pandemic would end in the United States in 3 or 4 months with a total of 60,000 deaths. In reality, it has lasted over 2 years, causing 1 million officially recorded deaths of Americans from COVID. In addition, when the IHME prediction was made in early March 2020, it didn't just stay as an academic publication. On the contrary, President Trump repeatedly cited it at White House news conferences to justify his claims that COVID was no worse than the flu and did not require a strong reaction by his government. In fact, Trump's incompetent and irresponsible handling of the pandemic was a contributing cause of those 1 million deaths. So what were the errors of the IHME? First of all, they used a simplistic mathematical model called curve fitting. That is, they took the curve of COVID cases in Wuhan, China. And at that time, in early March 2020, the only extensive data that was available came from China, came from Wuhan. There was beginning to be data from Italy, but they relied heavily on the Wuhan data. And as you recall, by March of 2020, the first big wave of the pandemic had largely died out in Wuhan. So it had a curve where it was rapidly increasing, then becoming stable, then rapidly decreasing. Pardon? They used that, and they took that curve and fit it to the early data of US cases, assuming that the same curve would apply. Now, their fundamental error was in assuming that the response of the government authorities and the general public in America would be the same as in Wuhan. This was a very strange assumption for them to make. In fact, in China, in January of 2020, right before the Tet holidays, that is the Chinese New Year's, Tet is what they call it in Vietnam. Recall that the central government took control of the situation and imposed very strong measures to combat the contagion. In contrast, in the United States, as I mentioned, the Trump government refused to take any strong action and minimize the significance of the pandemic. Secondly, the general public in China has a long tradition of taking very seriously people's responsibilities to those around them, to their neighbors, to their community, to their society. In the United States, there's a tradition of extremely strong individualism. And that has meant, in the case of the COVID pandemic, that a large fraction of the American public, an amazingly large fraction of the American public, really believes that they have the God-given right to defy public health regulations and to infect other people with a lethal virus. That's a situation that exists in the United States, and as I understand it, it simply does not exist in China. So those two differences are really fundamental, and IHME did not take them into account. Now, they failed to include in their team epidemiologists, sociologists, and others who know how to account for non-mathematical factors and could have explained to them that they have to take those factors into account. Another failure was that when Trump misused their mathematical model, they did not publicly object to that. They kept quiet about that, and they just enjoyed the fame they got from being constantly mentioned. Their institute was constantly mentioned at the president's news conferences. Some other misuses of mathematics and computer science in other areas. Well, one book that I recommend by Susan Landau called People Count, which is also about the pandemic. It explains how the automated contact tracing technology, that is smartphone apps that were designed by computer scientists, work badly. These are computer scientists in Europe and North America mainly, who design these automated methods to avoid having to use humans to do the contact tracing. And the reason why they work badly was basically that these scientists did not understand the living and working conditions of working class people. And so they did not form an interdisciplinary team with sociologists and others who could have explained to the computer scientists how less privileged people live. The actual computer scientists, major researchers in computer science, live a quite privileged existence compared to the average person in the West. And their work environment, their home environment is very different. And because they did not take this into account, their smartphone apps largely failed for most people. Another book that I recommend is Kathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, which documents how big data algorithms often treat the poor people and racial minorities very badly. So that also talks about the misuses of mathematics. Again, by people who are not taking into account the social effects of what they're doing. And there's pictures of those two books. I want to end with a positive example of computer scientists in my own field of research, mathematical cryptography and cybersecurity, whose broad outlook led them to write the most famous and influential paper in the history of cryptography. This was a paper written in 1976 by Whit Diffie and Martin Hellman called New Directions in Cryptography. It included some important technical advance called the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, but it went way beyond that. It clearly explained the potential for public key cryptography that later became used in e-commerce throughout the internet. And it outlined a vision for the future internet, although the internet itself did not exist until about 15 years later. And even now, the article New Directions in Cryptography is still widely studied. Here's a picture of Whit Diffie on the left with the beard and Martin Hellman on the right. By the way, Whit Diffie studied at MIT. Both authors are well educated in the humanities. They know how to write well, and they have a deep interest in the impact of technology on society. So the lessons from these examples are, first of all, that all of the major challenges in science and technology have human elements as well as technical ones. And if you want to become influential in the world of science and technology, and if you want to avoid the mistakes that come from a narrow technical approach, you need to become broadly educated in the humanities. Thank you for your attention. So now I'll turn it over to Anne to do her part. Now I have to screen sharing again. Share screen.
Okay, great, thanks. And just switch the slides.
Just go down here. Go down.
Okay.
Okay.
Greetings, everyone, and thanks to Professor Luke, Christine, for setting this up. I also want to say, yes, Christine was my graduate student, one of my best graduate students ever. I am incredibly proud to be associated with her. Okay, from the time I started my doctoral dissertation on the mathematician, socialist, feminist, and writer Sofia Kovalevskaya, I have been fascinated by the surprising elements of her story. Kovalevskaya came from patriarchal Russia, which in the 19th century was regarded as a backward country. She was the first woman in modern times to obtain a university professorship. She was the first woman on the editorial board of a scientific journal, and she won the prestigious Prix Bourdin of the French Academy of Sciences. She was the first woman elected to corresponding membership in the Russian Academy of Sciences. In fact, the rules of the Russian Academy had to be changed in order for people to vote on her membership. Oops. Okay, equally unusual was the fact that Kovalevskaya was one of a whole cohort of Russians who stormed the universities of Western Europe and opened university-level study to women. This first generation of women, who called themselves the generation of the 1860s, generation of the 60s really, overwhelmingly chose to study the natural sciences and medicine. they were encouraged and supported by their male counterparts, who included such luminaries as Ivan Sechenov, Dmitry Mendeleev, Ivan Pavlov, Alexander Borodin, Alexander Kovalevsky, Vladimir Kovalevsky, and Pyotr Kropotkin. I hope some of those names would probably be known to some people, at least Mendeleev's periodic table and Pyotr Kropotkin's ecological research, perhaps. For Kovalevskaya and her friends, science was beautiful, creative, and inherently progressive. Science pushed back the barriers of ignorance and superstition, and scientific discoveries pointed the way toward a brighter, more egalitarian future for everyone. Importantly, all of the scientists of the Russian generation of the 60s, men as well as women, saw no contradictions between their scientific pursuits and their progressive politics, nor did they see any reason why women could not participate fully in the scientific and radical political circles of the day. It was a really cool time to be a Russian scientist, to be a Russian feminist, and there was a lot of overlap in those categories. Now, at the same time that I was finishing my dissertation on Kovalevskaya and beginning to work on my second book, which was about the pioneering Russian women scientists of that whole generation, a group of scholars was starting to put forward a sweeping theory about the interactions of gender and science. And this is sometimes called postmodern gender and science theory. Put in its most general guise, the theory maintained that centuries of male domination of science have affected the content of the subject and have ensured that women have no place in scientific fields. In much of the writing of this tendency, one is asked to believe that the so-called feminine mind is unsuited not only to the study of science, but also to anything in the world of the intellect. And for these people, the world of the intellect is depicted as manipulative, soulless, objective, and they use this word in a negative way as a pejorative. And therefore, the world of the intellect is apparently essentially masculine. In the words of Evelyn Fox Keller, who is one of the most prominent writers of this tendency, she says, just as surely as inauthenticity is the cost a woman suffers by joining men in misogynist jokes, so it is equally the cost suffered by a woman who identifies with an image of the scientist modeled on the patriarchal husband. Only if she undergoes a radical disidentification from self can she share masculine pleasure in mastering a nature cast in the image of woman as passive, inert, and blind. Now, postmodern gender and science theorists often referred to what they call gender-object relations theory to explain the association of science with the masculine. In general terms, this says that a girl baby at a way pre-vocal point, she never sees the world as alienated from herself in the same way that a boy baby does. A boy baby, according to this theory, realizes very early that he is not the same gender as his mother, so he distances himself from her and thus begins to objectify the world around him. This makes him supposedly naturally more comfortable with objectivity and supposedly naturally more inclined toward the domination and mastery that are said to be integral parts of the scientific worldview. According to many postmodern gender science theorists, only men and women who try to be like men can be objective, because objectivity implies dissociation from the female first caretaker, that is, dissociation from the mother. Like many psychoanalytic theories and many theories of this type, philosophical, there's not a whole lot of scientific evidence for that. And in fact, I was horrified by this line of theorizing, in large part, I guess, I was inoculated against it in some sense, because the stories of Kovalevskaya and her Russian associates simply couldn't fit into this kind of simplistic generalizations being advanced by Keller and others. The generation of the 60s, as I said, saw not science as nurturing, as creative, as beautiful, as in no way is something more suited to men than women. As for the idea that object relations theory could explain male objectivity and female subjectivity, that struck me as particularly ludicrous, particularly ridiculous, and as if it were employing some sort of cartoon stereotypes of men and women, science and scientists. It seemed fairly absurd. Part of the problem seems to be that scientists and scholars were assuming that whatever the situation was for women in science in Western Europe and North America, it obviously had to be worse for women anywhere else in the world. The theory seemed to run that if women were a tiny percentage of scientists in Britain or Sweden or the US, then of course their percentages in other parts of the world would have to be lower. If women were not represented in a certain field in the West, say math or computer science or engineering, then of course one could not expect to find any women in those fields outside of the so-called developed countries. And I'm sure you all know that that's false, but that really is the image that's broadcast. And it turns out, for anyone who knows anything about the subject, that women have flourished and continue to flourish in a wide variety of fields, in a wide variety of historical and cultural contexts. And so for close to 40 years, I've taken great satisfaction in stressing the exceptions, the complexities, the nuances, the counterintuitive aspects of the interactions of gender and science. And basically my maxim is that if a generalization cannot stand up to historical and to cross-cultural scrutiny, then the generalization is worthless. Okay, before I get into specific stories, I just want to set down a couple of general principles. Women have always been more involved in the production of science, technology, and medicine than the average person thinks. Virtually all cultures of the world have produced women scientists, healers, and inventors. Well, but despite that, the history of the participation of women in the scientific enterprise and scientific communities has been uneven rather than a linear and triumphal progression from backwardness into enlightenment, though that's the story we often get. There are many stories of stagnation, of retrogression, of women's status in various fields. Koblitzs was the first woman in modern times to teach math at the university level. She taught at Stockholm University in Sweden. She confidently expected that in a few years, she would be followed by many others. She thought one of her students would take over her position. But in fact, there wasn't another woman professor of mathematics at the university for 100 or so years after Koblitzs' death in 1891. Unless you think that was a peculiarity of their math department, you should note that Sweden's percentages of women in all the sciences were in the 20th century among the lowest in the world, mostly averaging under 5% women professors in just about every STEM field. And I know that comes as a surprise to a lot of people, but it's absolutely correct. And a sort of curious thing, interesting thing, is that among the highest percentages of women professors in STEM fields at the same time that Sweden and the Netherlands, for example, and Great Britain were extremely low, were countries like Turkey and Kuwait. Sweden, by the way, in its official records, has managed to raise its percentages of women in STEM fields in the past couple of decades, in part because they made a very clever maneuver. What they did was they added the numbers of women in sixth form colleges into their totals. So they sort of, with a snap of their fingers, managed to get their stats looking a little bit more presentable. And speaking of percentages of women in STEM fields, at the organizational meeting of the Third World Organization of Women in Science, which is called TWOS, which was held on the grounds of the Third World Academy of Sciences in Trieste, Italy in 1988. Third World Academy of Sciences is usually referred to as TWAS. The Nobel Prize winning Pakistani physicist Abdus Salam told a fascinating story about how TWAS wound up enrolling a relatively high percentage of women scientists. TWAS sent a letter to each of the member countries of the Third World Academy, and they asked for a list of their 10 best scientists. The responses yielded virtually no women. So TWAS sent a follow-up letter asking for lists of the 10 best women scientists. Interestingly, it turned out that many of the women on those lists were more distinguished than a lot of the men on the first list. That was how TWAS wound up having 15% of its membership women at a time when the academies of science, both of the US and the USSR, had barely 5%. But the first impulse of the men in scientific leadership positions in TWAS constituent countries was to ignore their prominent women specialists. And that happens, unfortunately, a fair amount of the time, that people just sort of look past the prominent women. I have so many stories of that, it's not even funny. Okay, now most of my experiences with women in STEM fields, well, much of them anyway, in countries outside of Western Europe and North America have come by way of my directorship of the Koblitzs Fund, which is a small nonprofit foundation for the encouragement of women in STEM fields in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We took as the title Koblitzs in part because some of the initial money came from the profits of my first book, which was a biography of Koblitzs, but in part because she herself was extremely interested in encouraging women. And she would say things like that I consider it my duty to erase obstacles in the paths of others and help women get into good position for pursuing science and engineering and mathematics. She was very interested in those kinds of things. The Koblitzs Fund began in 1985, and our activities were exclusively in Vietnam at first. Neil and I had both been heavily involved in the anti-war movement during the US war of aggression against Vietnam. And we had a great deal of respect for our colleagues in Vietnam who were attempting to maintain scientific and professional life under conditions of intense hardship. Many of our acquaintances felt the same way. In 1974, Professor Mary Gray, who is one of the founders of the US Association for Women in Mathematics, offered to finance the participation of 2 Vietnamese delegates to the International Congress of Mathematicians in Vancouver, Canada, provided that one of them was a woman. And that was how Neil first met Hoang Xuan Xin. Xin was educated in France, but she returned to Vietnam during the war and was one of the first women full professors in any field. She taught at the Hanoi Pedagogical University. Xin was a member of parliament and a vice president of the Vietnam Women's Union, which called the VWU. She was also for many years the trainer for Vietnam's mathematical Olympiad team. She was often the only woman from any country involved in the Olympiads in the early years. And Vietnam had some extremely good results. And Xin was closely involved with setting up the Koblitzs Fund. We talked with her a lot about what would be the best way to deal with these things. And she also introduced us to Madame Nguyen Thi Binh, who will be discussed later. Okay, the next slide is on the left is Hoang Xuan Xin. In the middle is Mary Gray. And on the right is Vo Hung Anh, who I'll be talking about later as well. She's a physicist. And in this next slide, one of our earliest activities in Vietnam was the Regional Women in Science Conference we organized jointly with the VWU in 1987. Participants came from Cambodia, Cuba, Laos, Philippines, Soviet Central Asia, Thailand, and the US. The conference was heavily covered in the press and attended by some of the most prominent women scholars and political leaders in the country. University professors gave moving talks on the evacuation of various university departments to the jungles of the north in order to avoid US bombardment of Hanoi. Scientists also spoke about the devastating effects of US use of Agent Orange and napalm, the massive deforestation caused by the bombing, etc. It's interesting and horrible to know that the effects of Agent Orange and napalm are already into the third and fourth generation of people afterwards. The effects of those substances have been absolutely appalling. The genetic effects, sorry. Genetic effects really they're affecting people even who were not themselves exposed because they really have changed people's genetics. Okay, in the next slide, it's sort of sepia toned. It's obviously a very old slide. The woman sitting next to me, Neil is on the left, then I'm next. The woman sitting next to me is Nguyen Bin. Oh, sorry, Nguyen Din. Nguyen Din is a pretty amazing person. She was a general in the Vietnamese army. She was the commander of what they called the long-haired army. That was the set of all women units that were doing amazing things during the war. Some of the pictures that some of you might have seen at various points are women taking control of downed US pilots, for example. They also did huge amounts of work on constructing, reconstructing, and reconstructing the roads of the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail every time they got bombed. So when we encountered her, Din was the president of the Vietnam Women's Union, but just an absolutely illustrious freedom fighter. The person next to her is Ngobat Tain, who was also involved in protests against US involvement in Vietnam in the South. The next person is a translator, and I feel bad, I don't know his name, but after to the right, as you see on the screen, that is Madame Nguyen Thi Binh, who was, she was the 1969 lead delegate of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam at the Paris peace talks, and later a vice president of the Vietnam Women's Union. She's Minister of Education, and from 1992 to 2002, vice president of Vietnam. Also, for 30 years, Nguyen Thi Binh was the chair of the Koblitzs Prize Committee, including in the 10-year period when she was actually the vice president of the country. She was always deeply involved, and that's one of the reasons why the prizes have had tremendous prestige in Vietnam and received so much publicity in the media. In fact, people often tell us in Vietnam that the Koblitzs Fund, which is this tiny non-governmental organization, that we have much more name recognition and visibility in Vietnam than these really, really huge US foundations like the Rockefeller Fund. I think it's largely because of the fact that the fund from its start was very much a project of people like Nguyen Thi Binh. And so since her retirement, there seems to be a tradition of having the vice president of Vietnam be chair of the Koblitzs Prize Committee, and that's continued. In the following slides, these are from, most of them are from the early years. This is the initial conference, that Women in Science conference I talked about in 1987, and that is people meeting with Prime Minister Pham Van Dong. He met with all the participants in the Women in Science conference and spent a lot of time with us. That was an indication of the importance that Vietnam was attaching to this meeting. And this is a little bit later. This is me with Nguyen Thi Binh. As I said, this was the time when she was chair of the Koblitzs Prize Committee, but also she was vice president of the country at this time. We had many social occasions with her. She's an unbelievably cool woman. This was the time when we met with General Vo Nguyen Giap, who at the time was Minister of Science and Technology, and I'll talk about him a little bit more in a minute. This was one of a series of meetings where we tried to get people from the Ministry of Science and Technology to give us statistics about gender. And here's Vo Nguyen Giap and his daughter, the physicist Vo Hong Ayn. I'll be talking about her in a minute. Now, Giap is another incredibly interesting, amazing person. Wikipedia says one of the greatest military strategists of the 20th century. He was mastermind of the humiliating defeat of the French imperialism in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. He played a crucial role in Vietnamese success against the Americans. He was often called the Red Napoleon by his enemies. And as I said, he was Minister of Science and Technology when I met with him. Oops, sorry. Now, the conference saw the awarding of the first pair of Koblitzs prizes that year. Dozens of women scientists and scientific groups have been awarded the prizes since then. Although recipients have come from virtually all scientific fields and regions of the country, a large number of the prize winners have been in environmental, medical, and botanical specialties. Vietnamese scientists are intensely interested in investigating local plant resources, for example, that have been used in folk medicine for such ailments as cancer, hypertension, diabetes, glaucoma, and other things. One prize winner from outside of the biomedical and environmental areas was the physicist Vo Hong Ayn. That's her on the left. Ayn received her PhD in physics in the Soviet Union, and she worked at the Dubna Institute for nuclear research there. She published over 50 research papers in her specialty. Most of them were in Russian, but some in other languages. And Ayn's background was absolutely fascinating. She was the daughter of General Vo Nguyen Giap, who was the revolutionary military strategist called Red Napoleon. And her mother was Nguyen Thi Quang Thai, also a famous revolutionary. Her aunt was a famous revolutionary as well. And Ayn was raised by members of the Vietnam Women's Union who hid her because she could have been used against her father by the French. Now, as I said, our encounter with General Giap occurred when he was Minister of Science and Technology. And by the way, if any of you have been to Hanoi or are going there, you will notice that the highway from the airport into the city is named for General Giap. Now, Giap wanted us to increase our financial commitment to the prizes. That couldn't happen because we were running the Koblitzs on a shoestring budget, to say the least. We had very small resources. But we and members of the VWU leadership, including his daughter Ayn, were pressing him to collect statistics on women's participation in scientific leadership positions and high-level scientific exchanges. We never did get the statistics we wanted, but the lively meeting ended amicably, and it's always something we've talked about. It was just a very fascinating encounter. Okay, I'm going to switch streams here and talk not about the Koblitzs Fund at the moment. Oops. Okay. Among the horrible and insidious stereotypes that are promoted by the Western media are the prevailing images of women of the Middle East and Arab countries. The veiled Mideastern Arab Muslim woman is often portrayed as an uneducated, helpless victim of patriarchy. And most people, even academics, educated people who should know better, assume that means no women of the region could possibly be working in STEM fields. But in Iran, for example, mathematics is actually considered an appropriate field for women. And the stereotypes put forward by these modern, postmodern gender and science theorists that I talked about before would strike people in Iran as laughable. Take the example of Miriam Mirzakhani. She was treated like a rock star from the time of her outstanding performances in the International Math Olympiads as a teenager in Iran. Her picture is in most Irani women's high school math classrooms, and young girls strive to emulate her. Irani girls, in fact, often do well in international math and science competitions, in part because of the example of Miriam Mirzakhani, but also because of other Irani women who've done extremely well in STEM fields. Mirzakhani was the only woman ever awarded a Fields Medal. And the Fields Medal is basically the mathematics world's equivalent of a Nobel Prize. I also encountered a significant number of Arab women involved in the high-tech sector in Abu Dhabi, which is in the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. These women were mostly Lebanese, but also Jordanian, Kuwaiti, Palestinian, and Egyptian. There were engineers, computer scientists, systems analysts, and research scientists. And they had worked in Iraq, Bahrain, Egypt, Qatar, Oman, and several countries of Europe and North America, as well as the UAE. These women virtually never faced discrimination from their families. Moreover, they're generally treated much better by their male high-tech colleagues than women are in high-tech in Silicon Valley in the US. Some of you might have noticed there have been a bunch of stories recently about just incredibly sexist conduct on the part of high-tech males in Silicon Valley. Now, as a Kuwaiti woman engineer explained to me, just because her father was traditional, refused to dress in Western clothing, and worshiped regularly at the mosque, that didn't mean that he was conservative. And she took great pains to say traditional is not the same thing as conservative. On the contrary, her father was extremely proud of his two high-achieving daughters, both of whom were making successful careers for themselves in STEM fields. Interestingly, both now and historically, many of the most successful women in STEM fields have been or are working in a country not their own. Koblitzs worked in Sweden. The double Nobel Prize-winning physicist Marie Sklodowska-Curie worked in France. The German mathematician Emmy Noether worked in the US. There's also a curious phenomenon of mutual border crossing that goes on. Like you'll find German women professors, German women scientists who get jobs in Sweden. British women will go get their jobs in Germany. Swedish women will wind up in England. When Sweden launched the special postdoctoral program in math and physics about 15 years ago to address their appallingly bad record on women in STEM fields, it turned out that the first 10 women chosen for the program were all foreigners. Contrary to the sweeping generalizations made by the postmodern gender and science theorists, much of sexism and sexist stereotyping is actually culturally specific. Foreign women can often get away with violating specific gender norms because of their special status as foreigners. In some sense, the behavior of foreign women can be seen as less threatening to gender norms in a specific cultural context. I attended an international conference of women scientists in Bangalore in India several years ago, and some of the women joked, or they sort of joked, it's not really that funny, that perhaps they should organize an exchange between countries so that everyone would obtain a job in a country not their own. You know, everyone sort of changed positions somehow. There are lots of examples, so many incredibly cool women that through the decades of my being involved with this stuff, I've met, and they've been an inspiration to me for my whole academic career. I haven't really spoken about Africa or Latin America much. I'll just say a couple of things. A colleague I've met at several conferences was the Ghanaian from Ghana in Africa, Abba Andam. And she told a story about how she was shocked when she went to Great Britain, to the UK for graduate school. She went to Birmingham. She was the only woman in the graduate class of 20 in the Department of Geophysics. And so the only woman in this class of 20 people in graduate school at a university in the UK was a Ghanaian woman. She's a pretty interesting woman. She went back to Ghana. She realized that, well, her specialty wasn't of terribly much use for Ghana, but she retooled. And so she and her students in Ghana went around doing baseline measurements of radon and other poisonous substances, just so that there would be an idea of what the baseline measurements were. And there have been several Koblitzs Prize winners in Latin America who've done some really amazing things. In Cuba, in Peru, in El Salvador, and Nicaragua. A lot of them, like the prize winners in Vietnam, a lot of them are interested in things like medicinal plants. In El Salvador, for example, talking with the indigenous people of the region about the historic uses of indigenous plants and trying to capture that kind of folk knowledge before it is lost. And it can be lost very, very quickly. Also, there have been people who've looked at the refinement of vegetable waste. For example, the pulp of coffee or the skins and top leaves of pineapple, to use them as protein supplements to create yeast cakes as protein supplements for poor populations. Or things like an incredibly cheap solar cooker. One of our prize winners had made one out of basically aluminum foil, scrap wood, and glass fragments. And in the context of Salvadoran sunshine, that place is unbelievably hot. It worked pretty well, slowly, but pretty well, and at a cost of about $3 forever, and that was the cost. And there were also people doing work on solar water purification. The solar water purification could work pretty well for biological contaminants. Wasn't so good for getting heavy metals and things like that out of water. Okay, hopefully that's given us some food for thought. The interactions of gender and science, I'll say this until my grave, it's my mantra, it will probably be on my gravestone. It is complicated, to say the least. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Neil, and for this, well, I find it very fascinating seminar. So while we're waiting for some questions, so those of you, if you have questions, I guess it will be helpful if you can either raise your hand so that we can manage, right? And or maybe you can type in the chat so that we don't have many people speaking at the same time. But while we are waiting for people to collect their thoughts, maybe I'll begin by asking 2 questions. So the first question is, so what do you think of this emerging interest in the history of maps in non-Western countries? Remember that book deal that I shared with you? So I'm surprised that a publisher such as Viking is willing to pay a 6-figure payment for a book on specifically about the history of maps in non-Western countries. And last time I checked with Kitagawa, she says she is finalizing the manuscript to be submitted by the end of this month. So good luck with that. So what do you see? Yeah, I mean, because you guys are both very well-read scholars. Do you see an emerging readership in this area? So that's the first question. Second question, maybe more directed to Neil, and that is your notion of storytelling as not just relevant, but important for scientists. So in my class, in my teaching practice, I also highlight the importance of narrative. But I guess some students probably would have a hard time to try to disentangle storytelling from fiction writing. Because for them, yeah, they would say, hey, I'm not trying to tell a story, right? I am reporting the facts or whatever. So yeah, how would you, and of course, I don't agree with this simple lumping of storytelling with fiction, right? Writing. But yeah, I guess, where do you see the nuances? Yeah, how would you convince a physics major that, hey, you need to learn how to tell a good story when his career is not to become a fiction writer? So 2 questions.
Okay, so should I,
Yeah,
maybe
you might as well.
I could answer the second question. I think a lot of people who are scientists and workers in STEM fields enjoy reading biographies of people. For example, Anne's first book was quite successful among mathematicians because they liked reading stories about the early mathematicians of earlier times. It's part of our mathematical subculture to tell stories about them. So that's one example. But it's not just biographies that are forms of storytelling. There are history of the development. If you take something like Fermat's last theorem, even among people with no interest in mathematics, many people became fascinated with the story of this unsolved problem for more than 300 years, for 350 years. So a lot of these stories that come out of history and that come out of people's lives are nonfiction, but they're, as the expression goes, they read like fiction. That is, they could be a novel, but they're not, they're factual. So that is the origin, perhaps, of the storytelling part of the history of science. It comes out of historical stories and biographical stories. But even if you look at someone's current career, there's a story to that, from their years as a graduate student to a young researcher, and then a more senior researcher. And so sometimes in the sciences, there are dramatic controversies over whose theory is correct, or over whether an experiment was done correctly, and whose approach is the most promising. So there can be a lot of dramatic events going on in the sciences. There are a lot of exciting books about it that are completely factual, but they're as exciting to read as a lot of fiction. So I don't think storytelling is really far removed from the sciences at all. I think you find it, if you go looking for it, you'll find it everywhere. And I don't think there's that much difference between what, for the reader anyway, there's not much difference between reading a well-written biography or a well-written history of some scientific breakthrough and reading a fiction book. They're both very entertaining and very enlightening. It's just like good fiction, just as good fiction can have elements of fact or elements of education in it. Similarly, factual histories and factual information can be told like an entertaining story in a very similar way.
I would also add, well, let me sort of bounce back and forth. I agree with you, Christine. I was actually rather shocked at that large advance for that book. It's not that I don't think that that kind of topic is fascinating. It is, but that there will be a readership that will justify that kind of an advance is what I'm a bit skeptical about. I'm really surprised. Neil teaches a course in history of mathematics at his university. It's the only course in the history of mathematics at his university. And it's just a summer course. Maybe what they're thinking is that given the enormous size of, for example, China and India's markets, that will justify the book. Certainly, I think we both wish the best of luck, but I'm not sure. Well, we'll see. Maybe we'll be completely wrong, and it will be a bestseller, a New York Times bestseller.
But we tend to judge by our experience in the U.S. And in the U.S., books have to be actively marketed to sell a lot of copies. They have to be written about a lot in the paper. Now, in this case, the author does have access to the media to some extent. She's very well known. So maybe that will happen, but it's very unusual for that to happen for a good book, for a scholarly book. It's usually for books that have a mass appeal to the American public, including people who are not well educated. So it's possible that her book will be written about a lot in places like the New York Times, and a lot of people will buy it, but that would make it a very unusual book.
But also China, India, and Japan, I mean, that's enough of an audience that if it can be marketed in those places, then it's going to be a huge bestseller. It's just, it'll be yet another example of US readers being ignorant about the world.
But it's, for one, if they're going to sell it in India, especially, and also in China, for one, it should be translated. But for two, in India, where there are the educated people do speak English in most of the country, but still, it would have to be at a much lower price. Books in the United States are very expensive compared to books in countries like India or China. So. So the amount of money they're giving us in advance, I think they're planning on getting profits from sales in the U.S. and perhaps Western Europe, but that's an open question whether they'll actually make a profit on it.
I also wanted to get back to this question that your student had about, oh, all I do is I report the facts. That is probably the worst way to go into your career, saying that all I'm going to be doing is reporting the facts, because you're going to wind up having a tunnel vision view of your own field. I do a lot of proofreading and minor editing of Neil's work in cryptography and in especially the work that he's doing now on provable security and things like that. And the number of times that the authors of these papers are just making incredible blunders because they think all they're doing is reporting on just the technical facts, and they forget large areas of things. They're just not They don't
Right.
have enough vision. Yeah, and Neil should explain this better.
Well, what happens in many areas, especially in applied areas, is that there's a lot of controversy that arises. And and the facts require interpretation, and they require critical thinking. So for example, right now, today, just in the month of April, there's a major decision that's going to be made by the US government agency called the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST. It is deciding on which forms of cryptography to recommend for standardization for use by industry for what's called post-quantum cryptography. That means the type of computer security that will be necessary if at a future date there are so-called quantum computers that are able to break the current cryptography that's being used, that new types of cryptography will be necessary. There's huge controversy over which type, how do you evaluate which type is more secure based on present day knowledge, and who is doing a careful job of justifying their preferred method of cryptography. So in some ways, it's every bit as controversial as disputes that occur in, say, social science or some areas of the non-sciences. And so how you approach that, how you deal with controversial subjects, arises surprisingly often in technical areas, and in fact, if someone is not good at communicating to a broad public, they might have the best solution, but if they can't explain why it's best, their solution won't be chosen, because you have to convince people who are not technical experts, and you have to have debates where people are participating from various fields. So it's really much more than just determining facts. It's being able to interpret them, being able to explain them, being involved in arguments, sometimes in controversies. So it's really much more complicated than just facts.
That's very well said. Yeah, I think someone raised her hand,
Yeah.
Catherine Kwang.
Catherine
So,
Kwong.
Yes. Thank you for your lectures. I actually have several questions in my mind. So the first question is for Professor Neil, is the separation between science and humanities, education and research, is there exist for a long time, or is it just become increasingly prevalent in modern days? If it is becoming a prevalent phenomenon in modern days, what causes this increasing specialization? And also, is if STEM students shall receive a more comprehensive education in humanities, what about shall humanities students be compulsory to study STEM subjects too? What will be the benefits, or is it essential for both the humanities and the STEM subject students to learn from each other? And this is my question for the first part, and the second part is about gender and STEM fields. My question is why there had been this historical stereotype that women are not suitable for STEM. Also, it was mentioned in the presentation, the idea that the purpose of science is just to pursue facts or just to pursue absolute objective truth is not true. If so, what is the real purpose of doing science and doing math? Yeah, those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, so let me try to answer some of this. So I'm trying to remember what's it.
Well, in part, this bifurcation of the humanities and the sciences, you can trace it maybe at least back to C.P. Snow.
Well,
Go ahead.
Well, okay, I was going to mention that, but C.P. Snow wrote a book called about what he called the two culture problem, with the culture of people working in the humanities versus the culture of people working in the STEM field. He wrote this in about 1950s, about 70 years ago. But I think it really goes back earlier to the professionalization of many subjects in the 19th century. That's when, in very early times, there was no such thing really as a scientist. There were sort of they were called natural philosophers, and they would have many interests. There was not the type of specialization. But that changed a lot, especially in the 19th century, when professional societies started, and where universities started to take their present day form, and people became specialized. They realized that it was no longer possible for one person to know everything, and so there was a natural specialization that occurred. As far as how to characterize science rather than just looking for the facts, I think it is true that ultimately the purpose of science is to get the best possible approximation to an understanding of nature and understanding of things that are objective facts, But the process is not a simple one, that often there are wrong turns, often there are theories that seem to be justified scientifically, but later turn out not to be, or that are correct in a certain situation. But if you suddenly are able to look at much different scales of sizes, you look at cosmology, or you look at submicroscopic level and fundamental particles, you find out that completely different principles of physics actually apply at those levels. So it's not a process that becomes perfect. It's a process that hopefully can gradually come closer and closer. And it has some absolutely astounding achievements. Certainly the rapid development of the COVID vaccines, for example, was a tremendous triumph of modern science. It had never been done before, and it saved many, many thousands of lives. So there are also dramatic developments in other fields. And those come because of a closer and closer understanding of nature. But at the same time, as I said, there are controversies, and there are theories that turn out to be wrong or turn out to be not the best way to analyze things. And also, science is a human activity, which means that people have conflicts. For example, there are disagreements about who should get credit for something. There was a famous dispute between Newton and Leibniz and their followers, between people in continental Europe and people in Great Britain, over whether the field of mathematics, calculus, was invented by Leibniz or by Newton. Well, now we basically believe that both of them have about an equal share in it. But at the time, it was a bitter disagreement. So there can be very human elements in the science, which does not mean that it's not about objective facts. Ultimately, it is. But along the way, it's humans who are involved in it. So the objective facts are only part of the story. And as far as the question on humanities students studying the natural sciences, well, that's a more difficult matter, because I think for students in the sciences, it's not difficult to study. It's not difficult to read great literature. It's not difficult, really. It's no more difficult for someone in STEM fields than someone in other fields to study a foreign language or learn about a foreign culture. So you don't have to have a particular orientation toward the humanities in order to study it and greatly benefit from it. For non-scientists to benefit from the science, they can't really take the same specialized courses in the sciences that the science students take. In most cases anyway, they don't have the background for that. So if you want to solve that problem, that is, if you want to solve the problem of non-scientists being ignorant of the sciences much of the time, you have to develop special courses for them, special basic courses that can explain the sciences in a way that does not require advanced technical training. So I think in a way it's harder to teach science to non-scientists than to teach the humanities to scientists. And so what I'm suggesting should be a goal of education in the sciences, getting more humanities into science education is easier, actually. But what you're asking, your question is certainly a very good question, and it would certainly be desirable for people who, including people who are going to make decisions, people who become political leaders. If they understand more about the sciences, they might make better decisions. Of course, they can also get the advice of scientists, but it's very useful for non-scientists to have understanding of sciences. It's also useful for the average person because I think there's much damage done by ignorance, by the complete ignorance of science of much of the general public. In the US, for example, there's a huge anti-science movement. People who are denying the reality of climate change, who are denying the need to take vaccines, who are denying the theory of evolution because of superstition, because of religion, because of anti-scientific beliefs. And even people, very high officials, such as President Trump during that period, was opposed to the scientists on many issues of great importance. So ignorance of the science is a big problem, especially in the US and in a few other countries. In India also, superstition and anti-science attitudes connected with Hindu nationalism is a really big problem. And so some other countries too. So I think it's a very good question that it would be really good to improve the scientific education of the broad public, but it's a difficult thing to do.
Oh, yeah, we have someone else, Liu Ze, right? This is someone else who raised your hand. Yes. And if you want to turn on your camera for the speakers to see you, you're welcome.
Yeah. I thought, where's Niu Jie?
Yeah, I think this is, well, okay, this is my master student, Noah. He just turned on his camera. But
hello, I'm sorry. There might be some problem with my internet. Can you hear me now?
Okay.
no,
Okay.
loud and clear. Yeah.
Окей, здравствуйте, спасибо за очень интересную презентацию. Yes, I speak a little Russian because I major in Russian language during my undergrad. And thank you for this very interesting and informative presentation or seminar. May have one question for each of you. The first for Professor Neil Koblitz, it might be something about your experience in Moscow, because you've mentioned when you visited the USSR at the time there were there was the biggest amount of mathematicians in Moscow. So I'm interested because after all, I'm no expert in math, but I'm interested, like, in which regard is the atmosphere of math or of mathematics in Moscow at that time inspired you? Maybe I may try to understand you academically. I mean, in the field of math, but it may be like a bit too hard for me. But like maybe like the working atmosphere over there, possibly they can inspire you a bit. I'm curious about that. And the next question is it's for Professor Ann Koblitzs. It's about it's something about like the respect for science, because they Russian people at that time, or Soviet Union people, they thought science is such a beautiful thing and it will lead people for a better future. So like why women would not participate into it. I think they would idealize science, and they would love to like kind of just set apart some so-called discriminations. that kind of, I don't know whether that's so closely connected, but I listened to This American Life, that podcast, and I noticed a story about Black people in Soviet Union, because like there was a story about a Black girl's life in Moscow. Her partner at the time called her a monkey. If that were in the U.S., that would definitely be racist, or that would definitely be politically incorrect. But at that time, that black girl in Moscow, she didn't care, because that's just ignorance of Russian people over there. They don't even have the notion of Blackness or like so-called race. And so two stories together, I would think, okay, maybe in some sense, like so-called like identity politics, just in some sense don't apply to Russia or the USSR at that time. And even I know some Jewish people during the Second War, they would go to Russia because maybe because they think, okay, there was socialist idea, and they think, and some people would think, okay, they can provide an equal society, and they would not like hold this discrimination against us, things like that. And so some Jewish people would just go to the USSR and to see how things are goes, because like something like some really bad things could happen to them. I know it might not be a very strong link, but that's something I think can be related. That's all my question. Thank you.
Okay, first about the atmosphere in Moscow in the 1970s and 1980s, when I spent some time there. In mathematics, it was really a tremendously encouraging atmosphere, that there were so many students, very advanced students and mathematicians in Moscow, that they could have a seminar in a highly specialized area and maybe 50 people would come. And I remember perhaps my most exciting experience in the Soviet Union was when I gave a lecture at the Moscow Math Society meeting. And at this time, I had just recently started working in cryptography. So a friend of ours, a prominent mathematician named Fomenko, arranged for me to give a talk on cryptography at the Moscow Math Society. And I was very, very nervous about it, although I knew Russian quite well by then. But I knew that there would be more mathematicians, more famous mathematicians in the audience than I'd ever seen before in one place. And I never in my life gave a talk to such a distinguished group as I did that time in Moscow. It was also symbolic because it showed that in mathematics, anything is possible. So this was a time, this was in 1985, when relations were still very bad between the US and the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the first talk ever given to the Moscow Math Society about cryptography, about secret codes, was given by an American, namely me. And that was fine with everybody. Nobody objected to this because we had a tradition in mathematics that we were colleagues and we had great respect for each other, and it was not, and politics would not interfere with that. So there are many stories about mathematics transcending political and other barriers between people. It's the most international field of any field. And at this time in the Soviet Union, they tended to have their science and mathematics concentrated mainly in Moscow and to a lesser extent in Leningrad. And that meant that that the number of people was just, and the level of mathematics being done was tremendous. I was actually a little intimidated when I first visited the Soviet Union and found out that the students were a lot more advanced than I was at that time. And I had felt I had to work hard to try to catch up because because they were already publishing original work as undergraduate students, which I certainly was not doing. So, so it was really an inspiring atmosphere, what was going on there. And unfortunately, in fact, the history of Russia is an example of what Anne was talking about, how you do not always have progress in a good direction. When we were there, especially in the 1970s and early 1980s, still the Soviet Union was very strong and the government was following socialist policies. And what that meant, it did not mean there was not racism. We encountered racism in the Soviet Union in various ways. For example, there were Russians who told us, this was at a time when the US was, there was a lot of publicity internationally about racism in the United States and mistreatment of African Americans. But some Russians were telling us, a few, not most, but a few would say, oh, we think that America's right to be treating Black people this way because we don't like our African students. You know, there's a lot of resentment against the African students. In fact, some people told us, well, they come here and they have privileges that we don't have. You know, they can buy things in special stores using dollars that Russians couldn't do at that time. So, so why should we be helping them? And we don't like them, and so on. They would tell us these things, and they were really racist things. And so I remember remarking to one person, I said, well, yes, I think foreigners who travel tend to be privileged, you know, tend to be the wealthier people from their country. Poor people in any country in the world generally do not travel much internationally. So yes, they are probably relatively wealthy Africans compared to the average African. Similarly, those Americans who come are relatively wealthy. And we also obviously get to spend dollars in special stores. I'm sorry about that. It's not fair. I know we're getting privileges that you are not getting. And they say, oh, no, no, no. If the Americans do it, that's all right. It's when the Africans do it that they don't like it, you know. So, you know, there was a lot of that sort of racial resentment, not only against Africans, there was also some resentment between different Soviet people, because there are many Soviet nationalities that were not European, that were from Asia, Central Asia, the Caucasus. And there was a lot of prejudice along those lines. However, the government had a clear policy opposed to racial divisions within their country. They would strongly suppress any effort to foment racial conflict. That was a fundamental policy of the Soviet system. Unfortunately, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, things changed drastically. And it became a dangerous place, for example, for people from Africa and even from Vietnam, from other countries which were racially different. And for women, it also became a lot worse. And the level of public education became worse. So when we think back on the socialist period of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of positive things then, not everything, but a lot of very positive things. The support for culture, the support for women, the support for non-European nationalities. And so when we visited Soviet Central Asia, we talked to a woman who was the director of a scientific institute. And she said that the generation of her mother was forced to wear the veil and could not participate in scientific life at all, or even get educated. There was a lot of illiteracy among women too. But after the Russian Revolution, there was a big influence there, and women started taking off their veil and demanding equal rights. There were some men who murdered those women, who stoned them to death. Those women were tried and those men were punished. They were executed for killing the women, and that stopped, and women started to advance. And so these women we talked to in Soviet Central Asia were tremendously grateful to the Soviet system for allowing their progress. So we saw some very positive things in that time period. And we did not share the negative view of the Soviet Union that was the official American view. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a big downturn in science, in education, in culture, in racial relations, in many areas. And to this very day, Russia is performing a role. For example, they have close relations with the extreme right-wing racist political group in France that was fortunately defeated in the recent elections. And the situation has changed in a very negative way. So that's, I think, a good example of what Anne was saying about history not always going in a good direction.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same, that it is a great example of how things can change incredibly rapidly. The respect for science, the respect for women, the incredible cultural ferment and the interest in progressive ideas of the 1860s, you know, that was an amazing period that had an amazing flowering of women in all sorts of fields. But you're certainly not going to see that now. And a lot of that persisted through approximately the 1920s. And after that, dissipated in various ways. And the kind of things that Neil was talking about were certainly an issue, racist. But now it's like 100 times worse. And now it is estimated that of the skinheads, the really radically racist young people in the world, Russia has approximately half of them. So we're talking about some incredibly racist tendencies in Russia right now that are pretty appalling. And it's not that, you know, as Neil said, we couldn't have seen traces of that when we were there, but it was not approved of by the government, whereas now it really is. So very much of a difference.
And most of the people we knew, our friends, were not racist. You know, they have, people came to Moscow from all parts of the Soviet Union. The graduate students in mathematics included people from the Asian republics, such as Kazakhstan. One of our good friends was from Kazakhstan. And from the Tatar Autonomous Republic, from Uzbekistan, from Georgia and Armenia, from various racial and ethnic groups. And they were all studying together and helping each other in Moscow. A friend of ours, a good friend of ours, was Jewish, Russian Jewish, and he was giving free lessons to an Egyptian graduate student who was, of course, since the Egyptian was coming from a much weaker educational system than the Soviet Union had, he needed some additional help to catch up to the Russians, as I sort of also needed to catch up. Their level was so advanced. And this student was giving him free lessons, you know, not charging him anything, just doing that as his social responsibility to help him succeed. And the mathematician I worked with, his name is Yuri Manin. He had graduate students from all over the Soviet Union and also international graduate students, including our best friend in Vietnam,
personally affected you,
who later became a prominent Vietnamese mathematician. He was a student of Manin. Students came from different parts of the world to study in the Soviet Union. And in general, at that time, they were supported and they were helped, and they had a normal period of study there. The racism was not a major problem in the Soviet Union in our experience, although, as Anne says, we did encounter some individuals who made racist comments at times, but it was not the norm. And as Anne said, the government's policy was to oppose racism and oppose ethnic divisions. They believed in uniting their different populations into one country. You know, so it was very much against their interests to allow any type of racial division or conflict. But it's well known after the collapse of the Soviet Union as a bloc, as a united country and as a system of alliances, after that, there were bitter fights and even wars between different populations there that used to be united.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Thank you for your patience and kindness. Yeah, definitely. First, history in the USSR doesn't always move towards the right direction. And second, sorry for my unconscious uncarefulness, because I just checked the story I talked about. It happened in 1936, so definitely different periods. I should have done better job. And thanks for your patience and clarifications. Thank you very much, and I'm deeply sorry. Thank you very much.
Okay. Anyone else? We have around 20 minutes. If you have questions, you can. You can raise your hands or just unmute yourself, or if you prefer to type in Chinese, you can type in the chat, and then I can try to translate. I also want to add this question about what Anne said about this critique of Evelyn Fox Keller, because I reread that article that you wrote, right? You made that critique in this 1987 article. Is it International Journal of Science Education or something?
Right.
So I sometimes encounter history of science manuscripts. Now they ask me to review whether it's articles or sometimes thesis, sometimes even book manuscripts. And I encounter manuscripts that I thought, how should I put it? It's not that it's not well researched or not well written, but it's historiographically naive, because it doesn't, as you said, it doesn't reflect the complexity that you talked about, right? But then I run into this problem where I don't want to black box historical complexity itself, right? Because now it becomes the golden principle that, hey, you have to go to complexity, and it itself becomes a complexity. So without going into tautology, I guess it has to be specific in each case, right? But I do think there are some generalizations here about how do you teach graduate students doing history of science, whether it's in maps or in other areas, whether they are doing biographical studies of famous scientists, or maybe they are interested in a more external or sociological aspects. How do you reflect historiographical complexity, doing in a ways that are genuine, that are nuanced, but yet also communicable? Do you have any good suggestions?
Well, that's a big question. When I advise people, I think one of the things that you have to do if you have a small project, and I agree with you, Christine, that for the most part, the bigger the project is, the more danger you have of just making these generalizations that are not going to be terribly accurate. But one of the things that I think helps is to cast one's net widely, even if one is looking at a small topic. Just let's take the example of a biography. You have to look at sources adjacent to the person. And so, in other words, that you can't just look at things that directly mention the person you're looking at, for example. You need to know what the environment was at that time. And the way you get the environment at the time is not just by looking at sources that are directly connected with your subject. It used to be that one would stack walk. In other words, you'd go to the library and you'd look at books that you knew were very much associated with the topic that you were looking at, and you looked at the stuff that were, say, 10 books on each side of that book. And this could give you a wider lens in which to analyze the subject that you were looking at. And that works not just for biography, it works for, if you're looking at the external study of a particular field. But you really need to not, you have to read widely. And then once you have that, you can narrow down, I think, into more detailed subject. But yeah, go ahead.
I think an important feature of good research that I've seen from Anne, what Anne does, is to have a critical mind about sources. So, for example, when Anne was developing her biography of Koblitzs, she had to take into account that Koblitz's own writing about herself was somewhat unreliable for certain things. So, for example, her autobiography of her early years greatly downplayed her own role in her family and exaggerated her sister's role. But this was written, I believe, right after her sister died, and she wanted to pay tribute to her sister, and she wanted to minimize her own role. So Anne had to know that, had to take that into account. And that is a place where you'd expect something to be totally reliable. And then other things written about Koblitzs were greatly affected by the popular stereotypes of the time. And Anne had to take all this into account. It's easy for someone to read a book or look at a source and be seduced by it, to think, oh, this person is an expert, so I've got to believe everything they say. But even the best written sources, the ones that tempt you to believe everything they say, are likely to be heavily influenced by things that could distort them, by assumptions that people make. And so there was a lot of writing during the period of reaction against feminism in the 1890s. There was a lot of writing that made it look like Koblitzs was unhappy and unsuccessful. Fortunately, Anne had voluminous sources that show that this was utterly false. And so you have to be able to appreciate the complexity of the sources.
Yeah, and I would also, the time period, there is a real, things change very rapidly. This gets back to what Lawrence's question was about, but they change extremely rapidly. And in fact, over the course of someone's life, things change. Their observations of things that they might have done in their youth, they might not want to talk about as they get older, and they can reinterpret things that happened in their youth in light of what the politics and the social context is of the time in which they're writing. There are several great examples of this in my in the third book, where I was talking about abortifacient herbs and things like this. And one of the fascinating issues connected with trying to recover what these plants have been used for was that sometimes when people in their later life, say, for example, indigenous people converted to Christianity, once they converted to Christianity, suddenly they did not want to talk about those herbs anymore. And it was true of African-American midwives, for example, who had actually performed abortions early in their careers. And later they convert and they don't want to talk about them anymore. So their life becomes viewed in the context of these later phenomena. And so you really need always to bear in mind that when you look at a historical document, you can't just say, oh, these are the facts. You have to say, okay, what is the context in which these facts were presented? And is there a particular historical context, like Neil was talking about the reactionary anti-feminist movements of the 1890s, is that going to be a mirror through which the activities of these earlier women, for example, are going to be distorted?
And of course, as Anne said before, when you're dealing with a subject that relates to, say, human nature, or what humans are like, or men and women, you know, the methodology used by a lot of people who write about that is completely fallacious. They will do something, they will make a study by interviewing some white middle-class American college students about some subject. And from that, they will deduce something about human nature, you know, or they will do some experiments of a psychological sort, without taking into account that their sample is completely unrepresentative of all people of the world. You know, it's not even representative of people in our own country. So the methodology of a lot of people, including people who write quite well and write very popular books, their methodology is completely terrible. That's true of this gender object relation theory that Anne talked about. It's basically what we call pseudoscience. You know, it pretends to be science, it pretends to be scholarly, but if you look at its methodology, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't hold water. And that's where the complexity comes in. You cannot simply take some uniform group of people with similar backgrounds and then draw conclusions about all humanity based on those people. You have to take into account the tremendous variety that exists around the world. Unfortunately, a lot of Americans who write about these sorts of topics have no knowledge, really, or very little knowledge of other parts of the world. So they make vast generalizations based on a very simplistic mentality about the human experience.
We have Jerry. You want to unmute yourself? I think he is also a master's student, a doctoral student in my class. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for the professor's talk, and I will try to make my question short. What do you think of some educators try to teach science with history and the philosophy of science? I think this tradition can be traced as early as history of science as a discipline established in America, especially in Harvard University at 20th century, 1960s, I think. So is there any conflict between teaching history and teaching science, since the subject of the different subject may have some different teaching goals?
Well, no, I don't think there's any conflict at all. In fact, there's no conflict between teaching humanities generally and teaching scientific subjects. The problem that we find is that many people, for example, some people in schools of engineering or in some scientific fields might believe that their students have to enter the specialized fields as rapidly as possible. They want them to have extensive background in the sciences, a lot of mathematics courses, and that they might believe they don't have time for courses that are not really required for their specific needs in their STEM field. And they will object if people want their students to spend a lot of their time taking courses in other fields. Now, as I mentioned, MIT requires 8 courses outside of the scientific field. So clearly, there are many professors of scientific subjects who are not like that, who are happy to see their students study other fields. But sometimes the professors and sometimes the students themselves, quite often the students themselves believe that the way to be successful is to concentrate as much as possible on a single scientific specialty and pretty much ignore everything else. You know, and people can have successful careers if they do that. You know, it is possible, but it's not going to be they're not going to be broadly influential. They're not going to have a real impact on practical problems because you have to have a broader perspective for that. And so I think there are some obstacles to convincing people, including convincing the students themselves, that they should spend a lot of their time on history of science and other humanities areas. But it's not because of the nature of the subject. I think that a lot of prominent scientists and mathematicians really enjoy reading about the history of science and become quite knowledgeable about it. So it's not that there's any incompatibility between science and history of science. They really go together very well. It's just that you have to convince people that it's important for students to devote a part of their time to that.
But I just want to say that sometimes what happens, and maybe, Jerry, this is what you're thinking of, sometimes it happens that some of the people in history of science have gotten into the field because they left the sciences. And sometimes what happens with people like that is that they are a bit resentful of the sciences. And so the way they construct history of sciences is very much in opposition to working scientists. It's not everyone by any means. And in fact, it's not even most people, but you can occasionally, Christina's smiling, there is, you know, we all know these people, right? Who are bitter. And this can create a certain atmosphere in their views of history of science in which they're saying, ha, I got you there, ha, got you there. You're not
of course,
so
a very
smart
good example, and in her talk talks about Evelyn Fox Keller, who is a leader of the so-called postmodernist view of gender and science. And if you look at the quotation that Anne said, I think it becomes clear if you look at the background of Keller. She was trained as a physicist. She got her PhD in physics, but she did not remain. She clearly was not happy there. She was not successful there. She left the field.
Right. And so what did she do?
She's an unsuccessful scientist. And then she says that a woman who's successful as a scientist is disidentified from self, and she's not authentic. She's inauthentic, that she's not a real woman. That's just a vicious attack on women scientists. And at this time already in the 1980s, there were some extremely prominent women in her own field, in physics. You know, so what she was saying, she didn't mention names, but it was clearly an attack on other women who had been successful in science, and she had not been. She had chosen to leave the field. So you do have this problem, but as Anne says, these are individual cases, but unfortunately someone like Keller can be very influential. Young women could read her book and become discouraged from becoming scientists. That can happen, but hopefully there's not much influence of people like that anymore, I hope.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for your answer.
Yeah, I think that's called science renegade. Yeah, people who left natural sciences and somehow they become vindictive. So yeah. That's a good point. Any other questions? We have a few more minutes. Oh, I think someone else raised their hand. Can you unmute yourself? Yep. Oh, okay, Noah. Yeah, that's my.
Yeah.
my graduate student.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your wonderful lecture. So I have a short question for Anne Koblitzs, Professor Anne Koblitzs. And I noticed at 19th century, women's greatest access to knowledge as through educated men, such as Margaret Cavendish. And according to your examples, all your examples, all your mentioned women still have the same situation, I think, with the with those 17th centuries women's, and but after getting out of their home group, they got jobs, just as you mentioned, and so it is possible to presume that there is indeed a bad epistemology or stereotype of women within their own group, in a closed group. Thank you.
Well, I would just give some complimentary information. He took my class, Gender History of Science, and one of the required readings is Londa Schipinger's The Mind Has No Sex. So there, Schipinger, and this is an argument that she made, that there is this persistent exclusion of women from the scientific community ever since the early modern period, if not before. So the example that Noah gave, Margaret Cavendish. And Princess, what was that? Elizabeth of Bohemia. So these are exceptional, noble women. They engage in natural philosophy, but they are really exceptional. That proof is so difficult for highly intelligent women to even engage in intellectual conversation. And so I think what Noah was trying to say is that there is that lineage of exclusion of women. It seemed to prove that Evelyn Fox Keller had a point. Is that what you're trying to say, Noah?
I think Professor Anne Koblitzs, she gave me a few examples from Vietnam, from Russia. Those female scientists, they get knowledge as hard as Margaret Cavendish from. They have the same situation from getting knowledge. So I want to ask, indeed, they have same situation, but those such as the Vietnam scientists, they get jobs from another country. And so it is possible to presume that there is indeed a bad epistemology in their own group, in their own country, because they live in a closed group. When they get off of this group, so they get more opportunities. That's my question.
Yeah, no, I think that can very often be true. I think two things. First of all, Margaret Cavendish was very early, and there were other things going on with Margaret Cavendish besides her being discriminated against because she was a woman. Some people thought she was really fairly crazy, but this idea of going from one place to another place and therefore having more opportunities, that actually, I don't believe is something that Londa Schiebinger takes into account in her work. She's really a much more generalized account, and therefore I think she's not looking at the exceptions so much, which I very definitely am more looking at the exceptions. And there was something else I was going to say, and I just have totally forgotten what it was. Yeah, in Western Europe, in the 18th, 17th into 18th centuries, in certain situations, the kinds of things that Schiebinger is talking about do happen. There are closings of opportunities for intellectual women at that period in those specific circumstances. In botany, in ornithology, in geology, there are a lot of opportunities for women in that time period that a little bit later they won't have. In other fields, however, there start to be openings and most of these are things that happen in not outside of Western Europe. In other words, in Southern Europe, in Eastern Europe, and in particular in Russia. And so it's a very mixed picture, a much more mixed picture than is portrayed by that book of Schiebinger's. Although, you know, it's a great book. It's fascinating for what it does. I actually like one of her second books better, the one that talks about plant resources in the New
Nature's
World.
Body. Mm-hmm.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. I also listed that as a recommended study. Yeah, a recommended book. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that book.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I think, Noah, you mentioned something about Vietnam, because I noticed none of the participants engaged with the Vietnam aspect. So what was your question about, Noah, about the part about Vietnam? Can you say that again?
I think Professor Anne Koblitzs has answered my question about Vietnam part, about the different countries,
Okay.
the woman in different countries. Yeah.
Okay, so we it's after 11. I don't want to take up too much of your time, right? If I guess it's late, so many people have already logged out. But I take statistics at one point we do have around 140 people, and
Wow.
all of this is recorded. So we will send you a copy probably. Yeah,
I'm astounded. I thank all of you so much. We thank all of you so much, especially thank you, Christine, and thank you to the organizer, Shay Jiang, I think. And it was really fascinating. I can't believe how many people logged in.
Yeah. And we very much appreciate people's willingness to do it at an inconvenient hour for you at between 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock at night. So we much appreciate your doing it at a time when we could come.
Yeah, just a final question. Someone asked me, send me a private chat, whether you can send me a copy of your PowerPoint and whether it okay, yeah, because it is your copyright. So I guess if the speakers agree, yeah, we will maybe upload that to our website. Yeah. So
Sure.
So the answer is yes. Okay, so if no more questions, so we are deeply grateful. It's so early at your time, so you can go out and have breakfast, right? But whereas we go to the bed. So if no more questions, so yeah, so we give them a virtual praise. So okay, so take care. Take care.
Yes, take care. Great to see you.
Great to see you. Okay, so okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, I guess I'll leave here. Yeah.